All right, well, hello physical science students, and welcome to this video lecture that's going to deal with naming compounds. To begin, we're going to start out looking at ionic compounds. I want us to remember that ionic compounds result from ionic bonds. An ionic bond occurs between a metal and a nonmetal. Another really important thing here with ionic bonds is that there is a transfer of electrons going on. So typically the metal donates and it becomes a positive ion. Oops, not a positive in, a positive ion. Positive ion, otherwise known as a cation. And the nonmetal accepts the electron or electrons, and it becomes a negative ion as a result, otherwise known as an anion, not an onion. Okay, so this idea of a metal and nonmetal has some important implications for us in terms of naming ionic compounds. So to do this, I'm going to use a couple examples here. I'm going to, let's see, over here I'm going to have CaCl2. Charge of ion. Okay, now once we do these steps, our next step here is going to be identify nonmetal, and that's going to be our anion, and name it. Okay, so this part's a lot simpler. Really all we have to do here is take that nonmetal and we just change the ending to "ide." Okay, so we just change ending to "ide." So, for example, up here we have chlorine. So I would write here then chloride. Here in our other example I have fluorine. So I would change this to fluoride. Okay, so this down here, this is a flow chart to help you out in terms of how to name ionic compounds. First, identify that metal and name it. If it only forms one ion, you simply use the metal name. If it forms multiple ions, you need to be sure you can figure out what the charge is, or what the charge needs to be of that ion, and then denote that with a Roman numeral. The last step, we just take that nonmetal and we change the ending to "ide." So really the hardest part here is the metal stage, knowing whether it forms one ion or multiple, and then if it does form multiple, what's the actual charge and how are we going to denote that with the Roman numerals. Alright, so the next rules that we need to take a look at are how we name molecular compounds. And when I say molecular compounds, those are created through covalent bonds. Okay, covalent bonds. And what covalent bonds are, they occur between two nonmetals. Now remember, as opposed to ionic bonds where electrons are either given away or accepted, covalent bonds, the big aspect of those is that electrons are shared. Electrons are shared, not shard, shared. All right, so these are a little bit simpler to name, and I hope you saw that if you started the molecular compounds poll. So basically to identify these, we just need to see that there's two nonmetals in a particular chemical formula. And for the first, well, let's just use an example here. Let's say that I have CO2. Okay, so first things first, if this first nonmetal, if it has no subscript attached to it, that there's just one of that element present, well, we just name it what it is. So here we would say carbon. And then the second nonmetal here, notice that it has a subscript. It's saying 2. So we have to utilize prefixes to denote how many of those oxygens are actually there. So for our prefix for 2 is di, so we're going to say carbon dioxide. Okay, but now let's say that I had one that looks like this. My next example here. Let's say that we had N2O5. Okay, well now notice our first nonmetal here, there's not, there actually is a subscript here. We have 2 nitrogens, so now we actually have to add a prefix in before that. Oh, what happened there? We actually have to add a prefix in before that, the first name. So we're going to say here dinitrogen, and then we have 5 oxygens, so the prefix there is going to be pent, and really it's penta, but we drop that A at the end and we say pentoxide. Okay, so the big thing here is that really all we're doing when we name molecular compounds that occur through these covalent bonds is we're just adding prefixes in before the actual element name. Now we have several different prefixes. I'll write a few out here. The first one, mono, that means 1. Di means 2. Next we have tri, which is 3. We have tetra, which is 4. Penta, 5. Hexa, 6. Hepta, 7. Octa, 8. And then our last two here, we have nona, which is 9, and then deca, which is 10. Okay, so those are our big prefixes that we would use. Now, again, remember that either the first or the second could have one of those prefixes. However, if there's only one of those elements present within that molecular compound, we don't use a subscript for the first one. Okay. Now, let's say that we had, let's say that we just had CO. Well, notice that we only have one of the second one as well, but here, if there's only one of the second, we still use a prefix here, which we would be using mono. So the name for this guy would be carbon monoxide. Okay, so I think molecular compounds are a little bit easier to name than ionic. Be sure that you review the ionic compound notes because those are a little bit trickier. And with that being said, take care, physical science students.